So we're in the home stretch. This is very exciting. I want to thank you guys for hanging with us. I hope everyone's been enjoying the program. I will tell you, I've enjoyed all of the panels, but this one is going to be my favorite. So let me introduce the panelists. First, Nikki Waller from the Wall Street Journal, who's going to be moderating today. And Nikki's got her work cut out for her. Because, Nikki, you've got three friends of mine coming up here, all of whom are not short of opinions and are all incredibly accomplished. Why don't we ask, do we have any order you want them in?
Why don't we go in the order that people are on the
That
marquee
makes sense.
here?
Brian Miller, the general counsel from Handy, unbelievable company, one of the bellwethers of the OnDemand Economy. We have our good friend William Weissman. William gets embarrassed when I say that of all the future of work conferences I go to and all the attorneys I get to speak, William is the only one that I stay and listen to. This is the smartest on-demand attorney in the country. And then a man that needs no introduction, Brad Tusk. I can't even begin to go through your background. Thank you for joining us, Brad.
All right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you, WorkMarket, for having us today. And to everybody in the room, good news. You are under an hour from drinks in the open bar, so hang tight. We'll try to keep it interesting. It is a total pleasure to have you guys here today. I cover all management news for the Wall Street Journal, and we are very interested in the future of work. You guys are living and breathing the future of work. So without further ado, let's just jump right in. I would love to hear from each of you a really quick 30-second snapshot on what is the state of play in the on-demand economy right now. Brian.
Yeah, so thank you, Nikki, and thanks everyone for having me here today. Look, it's an exciting time, right? I think no one realized how much this would change the world for work, right? I think the technology, the GPS acquisition, you kind of knew you were unleashing a lot of incredible technologies, but we're essentially in the age of the Jetsons, right? Whereas you can summon so many things instantly. I think consumers think naturally about themselves, right? I want this product, I want this service, how quickly I can get this delivered. I think we've started in the past couple of years really being much more cognizant about the people who are providing those services. I think that is radically shifting people who are looking for income opportunities, right? Before, if you were looking for part-time, flexible work, it was really hard. You had to post coffee shops, maybe yellow pages, ask around the neighborhood. You still see them around New York, those flyers on doors. With this, once you've qualified on, you could drive, you could deliver food, you could clean homes. If you have handyman skills, you can drive it. That's incredibly powerful, right? Whereas people can earn income when they want, whenever they want. And I think that's really shifting how we view work. And frankly, as William will probably go into more, I think the labor laws never envisioned that, right? You think of the 1930s when most of them came in place. No one envisioned that, hey, I'd press a button and I could get a couple hours work later that day.
Yeah, and we'll certainly dive into that. I think we're still in the post-Upton Sinclair land of labor laws. So, William, what do you think? Where are we at right now?
I think we're at the beginning, actually, of I don't know how long it'll take, maybe 30 or 40 years, but we're at the beginning of a big shift in the nature of work as it relates to the legal framework that we have. And so, as Brian just said, we have 1930 era's laws, and we have a 21st century economy, and they don't match at all. And there's a lot of tension between those two. But I think over time, that tension will disappear as we make changes to the legal system. I personally think one of the biggest changes we have to make is sort of untethering from firms and having, instead of an employer-centric legal system, we need an individual-centric legal system, one that puts sort of the individual at the center, where benefits are not tied to a firm. Healthcare is not tied to a firm. Retirement's not tied to a firm. They're tied to the individual. We have a little bit of that. Things like COBRA were a start, but they're not nearly complete, and we're just beginning to see that affordable healthcare, Obamacare, right? Whether it survives much longer or not, was an attempt in some ways to do that as well. And so if we want a society in which we take care of individuals, we've got to make these shifts. And we're just starting. Because the nature of work is not going to go back to the old, I go from 9 to 5 to the same place for 40 years. It's never going to happen. We're moving away from it. And I think for the better, both for individuals and firms. But Yeah.
And Bradley, you work for you are advising some of these firms who are the big disruptors. Like to a great extent, we can blame all this on you.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
what do you see from your vantage?
I think we're at this pivotal moment right now where there are tens and tens and tens of millions of people who either use the on-demand economy or work in the on-demand economy. And they understand, as a provider or as a consumer, the benefit that it brings. But there's also tens of millions of people who don't interact with it, and their leaders, whether it's in the political spectrum, labor, others, I think still envision the world in kind of W-2 traditional structure, and they want to put the genie back in the bottle. And the thing that I've learned from all the different fights that we have on behalf of startups with entrenched interests is there's always this moment where a movement's getting started, there's a consumer base, but the entrenched interests still have a lot of political power, and the question is, can they shove the genie back in the bottle or not? The answer is almost always no, you can't. Once it's out, it's out. But they don't know that yet. And so you're going to see a lot of ugly fighting over the next 5 to 10 years, which then leads to the kind of legal changes that William's talking about, where ultimately we shift completely, but we're in this sort of cultural transitional moment right now.
What do you think people are getting wrong? To follow up on what you're saying, what do you think people are getting? What do you think these entrenched forces are getting wrong?
Well,
like,
two
how
things.
is this
Yeah.
equal to
Well,
a
there's two
W-2?
things. One is they look out for their own interests, right? So, for example, and Brian and I are both working on a issue right now in a bunch of states that would create portable benefits for a lot of sharing economy workers. If you're a labor union, you might say if people can have all the flexibility of being an independent contractor and all of the benefits they normally have to get, they can normally get when they're a W-2 employee, why pay union dues? Why go through all of this structure? So they face an existential threat. If you're a politician and you're relying on contributions from those interests for both your campaigns and for get out the vote, you're likely to do their bidding. And so one is they've got their own biases. The second, there was a New York Times editorial about a week and a half ago that really excoriated the sharing economy. And I think, they just don't get it. I mean, they're working, these are people who never...
What don't they get?
They think that everyone who's an independent contractor is too naive and too stupid to realize that they should want to be a W-2. And they don't fundamentally understand that a lot of these people are retirees or students or caregivers or have a bunch of other things that they want to do, and they choose to be on these platforms, and they just assume, in that same very paternalistic way that a lot of New York Times editorials tend to read, that they're much smarter than everyone else, and they have to watch out for them because they're too dumb to watch out for themselves. So I think people are either motivated by self-interest or by this very outdated paternalistic.
And Brian, at Handy, what have you guys discovered? What are the biggest upsides and the biggest downsides to using an on-demand labor force?
So, I think one of the things that we're just surprised of, just basically two big facts, right? The number of people who want to work this way. So, kind of to Bradley's point, these marketplaces only work when you have two sides, right? You need to have buyers and sellers at a very simple point, right? We know there's consumer demand. It doesn't work if no one's going to provide the services. So just Handy alone, in about a little less than 5 years, we've had 1.5 million people apply to be on the platform as a service provider. So that means that of all opportunities out there, this is something they actively seek. Now, we accept about 5-6% because we want to make sure we have high quality people on it. But again, think of, we have to show that we're better than the alternative. And particularly for us, home services traditionally been gray market, under the table, cash-based payments, right? So workers are in that. No formal economy, no protections. And by bringing in kind of a transparent platform, they know what they're getting paid. They know if there's an issue, where to go to. And so we've stepped it forward. I think the challenges we are now, it's kind of William alluded to, the labor laws are outdated, right? I think decoupling benefits from employment is a big step. The ACA is a smart step in that. What Bradley and I are working on, New York, California, is taking that a step further, right? This idea of portable benefits where workers can make contributions regardless of where they earn income and have access to benefits, the social safety net, in a way that they wouldn't hitherto.
How important is the ACA for companies like yours, companies like the ones that you advise, for allowing there to be a pool of workers like that? When we have been talking to people who are contractors or who are in, some form of contingent labor, what we hear from a lot of them is either it's because of the ACA that I can do this or because of my partner's employer-provided insurance, and that is obviously an imperfect kind of structure. So how important is it to be able to recruit a good workforce?
And I don't know, or I'm reluctant to believe that the people who wrote the ACA actually understood everything that we're talking about today 7 years ago and said, I'm going to create, but they really did end up, even inadvertently, foreseeing this, and I think recognizing that this portable nature of healthcare could be really important to a lot of people, even though obviously they didn't really anticipate the on-demand economy at all. So I do think it's important. I also just don't think if you look at the debacle that we saw in Congress over the last couple of months on healthcare.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, that it's going away, right? Ultimately the ACA may be amended in different ways, but ultimately taking away the ability for people to purchase healthcare on some sort of exchange outside of traditional employment structure, I think that's pretty safe and here to stay. And so, yeah, I do think it's important, but I also think that I'm not worried about it being in jeopardy.
I've got a quick snap poll from the group here. How many of you work in companies where there is a kind of a blended workforce, where that you don't have all W-2s or all 1099s? Yeah, both. All right, it's pretty good. William, what are the legal upsides and downsides of that? What are some of the risks?
Well, there are several. One of the risks, of course, is that workers are misclassified, right? And so you haven't withheld taxes, or you haven't covered them with workers' compensation, things of that nature. And then you're exposed either to a government audit, or somebody gets hurt, those types of risks. There's two kinds of risks, right? There's insurable and uninsurable risks. Taxes are not an insurable risk, injuries are. So there are some risks that you can manage better than others. Then you have issues of who's really the employer. That has been a question that the government has asked for decades without any good answer. We've come up with various scenarios like joint employment or co-employment, joint employer, single entity, all of these things to try to figure out who should be responsible. And so those are the risks that are out there. And what you see, and I was thinking about this, and we talked about it briefly before, and listening to the panels earlier, and you talking about your blended teams, as a employment lawyer, my first thought is, okay, who's hiring and firing, who's evaluating them, who's making decisions about what they're doing, these blended teams, and are you creating risk for yourself that someone is sort of being controlled and therefore should be your employee? And no one really mentioned any of those issues, but they're looming out there. So ultimately, though, the risk is really just money, right? Because that's what you're talking about. Is it going to cost more? Is it going to cost less? One thing I hear all the time is we don't have budget, right? We don't have budget for FTEs. We talked about that. Someone talked about that a little earlier. So you go out into the marketplace, and sometimes you spend a lot more money than you would. And of course, WorkMarket and is trying to drive that price down for you in different ways. But there isn't always a recognition of the realities of what you're doing. Are they really benefiting the company or not? I think, again, and I would give it maybe a 40-year timeline because of the entrenched. Well, the entrenched. It isn't. It is. It seems that's sort of the lifespan of people's memories is about 40 years because that coincides with someone's career, and the people who are in power today will be gone by then. But if we really got rid of the distinction between employees and independent contractors, all of this would be a lot smoother, and we wouldn't care. You could assemble the right people without worrying about all of this compliance. And again, if you untethered the benefits and that side of it, because it's all employer-driven, If you have an employer, then they're contributing to Social Security, and they're paying the unemployment insurance, and they're covering the workers' comp.
So what would that take in your all of your view? Like to have this kind of basic subsystem where everybody has portable benefits. What all do we need? We're talking about healthcare, but what are the other components of that?
Substantively or politically?
Both.
I'll do the politics, that's my job.
I'll say substance. So you think of three kind of main buckets, right? So there's kind of health benefits, right? So health, dental, vision, right? Kind of how do you take care of yourself today, who you are. Then you think of income stabilization, right? Disability, workers' comp, an idea of some sort of unemployment insurance. Now, obviously, if work's fluid, then some of those matters relevant. And then the third category, and I'd put paid family leave in that as well, right? So kind of what happens when I'm not working today. And then the third bucket is retirement savings. What happens when I stop working for good? What am I going to be relying upon for income stream? So those, I think, the three categories you have to solve for.
How do you build, and actually, obviously Handy is still very new, but I don't know how much your cleaners are making per hour, but how do you build retirement off of that? How do we, beyond Social Security, but how do you have an individual who has not just work but a career?
No, I think so look, at Handy, we kind of always took a strong position that, we wanted everyone to have good income opportunities on the platform, right? So nationwide, when we launched the company about 5 years ago, it was a minimum of $15 per hour for just kind of no experience, no rating, getting up to about $45 per hour for more skilled trades. And obviously certain markets like New York, California are more than that, right? So we kind of took the principle of we want good income opportunities for people. I think the challenge, though, is forcing people to make contributions on top of that, right? And people are very bad about voluntary behavior. They're much better when it's default, right? You think of 401k contributions, right? When the company makes it mandatory, you have very high participation rates, and when you don't, you have very low participation rates. I think one of the things that we're looking at, Governor Cuomo is announcing a task force on this, is exploring portable benefits for the sharing economy, right? The idea that workers, and with changes of law, because you can't do it today, there could be contributions made on behalf of workers to accounts just like that. So it kind of almost forces hey, look, we're already putting something aside. We can't do that today because, labor laws, 1930s.
Right, yeah, so what do we need politically to make it all happen?
So I think you would need one Republican Congress, because they have not only no need for unions in the near term territorial board, but antipathy towards them. Then you need a president who really thinks about this stuff and understands it. So, and I'm biased because I used to work for him, but had Mike Bloomberg been president, he would have got it. Maybe a guy like Mark Cuban, Sheryl Sandberg. I don't think this president, I don't even know if he's aware of the distinctions between W-2 and 1099 and everything else.
It's pretty into coal miners.
Yes, I don't know that he's really thinking about this one way or another. But you need a president who's really driving change. You probably need a Republican Congress. But the added complication, and William knows this stuff better than anyone, is all of these laws are both encapsulated in federal statute and in state statute, right? So ultimately, you would then need 50 different states to ratify something in some form as well. They don't have to be the same thing. So that's where it gets difficult. I think you could even see on a much smaller level the kind of stuff that Brian and I are working on. Things pass in some states, things pass in Washington, D.C., and then kind of a back and forth period over 5 or 10 years where we're doing it piecemeal until maybe one day we get a president visionary enough to actually try to do something real.
And, talking about some of this stuff, and talking about the political environment, you guys are going through the states because you see that as a stronger path to
No,
getting some
we're
of
doing
this?
both. We're working on the federal level as well, but the reality is we need change on both. Either one could provide a certain amount of certainty and benefit, but if you really want to have your bases covered, you would need both. And then on the states, it just totally depends. I mean, in a perfect world, you get a New York or California because that sends a really strong message to all the other blue states that this is safe to do, right? States tend to be like sheep. They'll kind of follow I used to be the deputy governor of Illinois. And to my view, it was like the whole point of being in government was to do stuff that was new and exciting. So I would say, we're going to be the first state to import prescription drugs from Europe and Canada, whatever it was. And they'd always say, we want to be the 12th, right? And that's typically how it works. So, you need both. Passing in red states is not nearly as hard. Nothing's easy, but not nearly as hard. But it doesn't have the same sort of domino effect.
And William, what do you think is happening right now with regards to these issues in the Department of Labor? Based on what you're looking at and what you hear? You have a pained look on your face.
Yeah. I tell my kids all the time, if we didn't have a president, 99% of the government would continue to just run along on its own, right? And the administration has been very slow for various reasons to appoint people, right, into positions. And the government is continuing to function day in and day out. I think the biggest problem is, whoever the Secretary of Labor is, or whoever the Secretary of Treasury is, they're not the person that's working day in and day out in the trenches, right? So they may have big ideas, but the auditor that comes knocking on your door to do an audit doesn't care very much about what the high-level policy is. They have a job, which is typically to either find fault or find revenue, and that's their mission, and they will continue to do that. And so, at that low level in the Department of Labor, I wouldn't expect a whole lot to change. They're going to continue to they have a mission, which is to help employees, labor, with whether it's, unpaid wages, discrimination claims, whatever it is, and they will continue that mission. So I don't expect a lot to change, certainly in the short term, either at IRS, Department of Labor, or some of the other sub-agencies like OFCCP, they will continue that mission because the people who actually do the work, they're just like this right now.
Yeah. So take me through what should companies be thinking about, like companies perhaps like the ones in this room, be thinking about when they are considering working with some kind of contingent or on-demand labor. What should be going through their minds?
Since you are the counsel for a company that does that.
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing you start a business is, what does my attorney say? I mean, no one thinks that, right? People, right? It's true. I mean, that's
Right.
one of those jokes, right? You drop out of business school, you drop out of college, and think, okay, let me talk to my attorney if the best way to structure a business. No one does that, right? I think, but the challenge is though these issues are so undecided, right? It kind of is, look, you have federal law, you have state law, you have different departments within the same state having different guidance. It's really confusing. I mean, one of my roles is just putting bright lines in how we do our business, making it clear for our team who are at headquarters how they operate, making sure how that, kind of the marketplace, the people that actually use the platform to find services is very differently. I mean, frankly, we probably touch more things than the average business would like, but the laws are so vague and kind of the misclassification risks aren't small that you have to be cautious of that.
And what kind of agility does a company need to think about work kind of differently if you are thinking about either adding functions or changing things that you do?
Right. So I mean, I think for us, look, I think we're mature enough that you have a counsel in the company. So there's a lot of conversations when we launch new business lines. We're thinking new ideas. I think the challenge is, as millennial workforce, they have very different work motivations, right? I think for them, flexibility is a huge part of that, regardless how they work, right? Whether it's if they're independent contractor or they want to be tied to a company. It's really setting our environment to adapt to those, whether they're an employee or whether they use our platform, making sure they still have as much flexibility as possible.
But in this, and I think one of the things, like speaking of Department of Labor, I know you guys are all labor nerds, and so
Reluctantly.
just like all of us, but like David Weil at Labor Department has talked about the fissured workforce, in which we have really two kinds of jobs and two kinds of workers in America. And it seems like there's the W-2 kind and the 1099 kind, and there's one that can maybe buy houses and send their kids to pretty good colleges, and one that is having a bigger struggle. Do you think that's true, or how do you see that playing out?
I mean, it's true right now because of the system that we have, right? Where at the moment, most of the on-demand jobs tend to still be on the lower ending pay of the spectrum, although I will note, and I'll do some promotion for you, the average wage for a handy professional is way greater than not just minimum wage, but what all the advocates call for living wage, right? So it's actually better compensated than if you were to do the same job at a traditional W-2 employer.
But they're working like 15 hours a week, so it's...
Yeah, because typically they're choosing to do it. Look, we have enough demand for them to work 50 hours if they wanted to, but these are people who this is what they're choosing to do. I think until the system that William and the vision that William outlined really happens, where we don't distinguish between these two things anymore, you're still going to see jobs line up where the easier to do lower skilled jobs are potentially more on the independent contractor side and the other on W-2. But long term, I mean, that should change because ultimately the whole system we have is outmoded.
Guys, I have way more that I could ask you, but I also wanted to turn it over to the audience for Q&A if anybody has any questions that they want to throw in. Yes.
Well, I certainly have a question.
Oh, and please identify yourself so we know who you are.
Excuse me, I'm Sean Souls with Mega Services, and I've worked both sides, and I hear this argument about the government's lack of foresight, the president, et cetera. What I kind of look at is the average freelancer doesn't really want to change. These guys aren't thinking about the future. They're not raising a stink with their politicians, anything else, because they're skating under the radar. They're able to claim so much on taxes, they're not paying taxes, they're not paying Social Security. So I think the real movement might be to educate the freelancers that they're damaging themselves, not to educate the top people. So I always say make the movement from bottom up, not top down. I'm just asking if that's is that what you guys see or disagree?
So grassroots campaigns like that, I have found in my experience, work sometimes. So if you take Uber, for example, we almost always, when we run into a real regulatory issue, will mobilize our customers and our drivers and kind of overwhelm city council, state legislature, whatever it is. The drivers are sometimes decent about it. FanDuel because people who do play fantasy sports really love fantasy sports, when they're setting their lineup and the alert pops up, this may go away in 2 weeks if your state legislature doesn't pass it, that works. I think we have found that it is harder, for example, on the cleaning side, which people working 15 hours a week and they're doing other stuff, to get them politically engaged as well. And we've, working with other companies in the coalition like Instacart or TaskRabbit, DoorDash, Postmates, they're all finding the same issues. So theoretically, absolutely, and it has worked in some cases. So far, either we're not good at it or it's just fundamentally harder, but we have been able to do it effectively here to date.
And take the other theme, actually, that people enjoy it, right? That is one of the things that we find. We've done surveys, we've had third parties, and the biggest reason people they like the flexibility, right? If you think for 15 hours a week, choosing when you want those 15 hours, it's pretty hard to find alternatives for that, right? And I think as we talked about as the shift, right, as you see kind of this more seamless process where you have all the benefits regardless how you earn your income, I think you'll see more higher and higher end professions also taking that same path.
Anyone else? Go to the front.
I'm Don. I have this question. Looking at a lot of different portfolio companies and people trying to use on-demand economy, and William, you talked about this a minute ago. One of the concerns you have is you have these very talented people who are freelancers, and they start to do work for you regularly. They're not on the staff, but they do work for you however many hours on a fairly regular basis. And some of them are like, well, I'd really like to sit in on your team meetings because then you wouldn't be regurgitating all this to me, and it would really help me in the creative process. And then someone from legal finds out they're sitting in on a team meetings, and they're like, whoa, we can't have this person on a team meeting because now that's considered that they're part of the team. And so to your point, these things are just so outdated, it's very difficult. So I don't know if you can speak any further to that, but there's a common sense part of this, and then there's just a ridiculous side of things that are impeding really innovation in a way.
Yeah, the factors that get used to determine whether someone's an employee or an independent contractor today don't work, right? So, for example, one factor used to be, who controlled the workplace. Well, people work all over now, and you have telecommuting, right? So your employees aren't on site anymore. And so what's the difference between a telecommuting employee and a freelancer who works from home? You can't tell the difference, right? So the factors have broken down to the point where they're pretty much useless. But as a lawyer, right, you hear something like that, they're on a team meeting, or they're listed, they have a company email address. And you see these things and you say these are risks because, again, some government auditor who has a very narrow task to do, which is to find revenue, or ding you for something. Because if they don't ever ding you, then what's the purpose of their existence, right? Government has to find something wrong. Otherwise, if we all did everything correct all the time, we wouldn't need all these regulators. So they have self-interest too, kind of like the unions, right, in justifying their existence. So they can always find something like sitting in meetings. So you have to be very careful. And at the same time, there's this inefficiency, as you just pointed out, to having a long chain of this goes up and then it comes back down to you. And so we need to move away from those factors. And some we have a little bit, but some we haven't. But there's no good solution in the current framework that we have. It just isn't.
Any other questions? For the gentleman back there. Got to make the mic runner run.
Unionization rates, as you know, have decreased by half since 1983 to about 10% now of the workforce. Even though Pew will say that interest in unions is increasing as the participation rates are going down, and millennials actually have a lot more interest in unions than older generations. Do you see that because of the gig economy that there'll be a greater interest in unionization, or do you think that there'll be changes in the National Labor Relations Act or the way that workers can organize themselves in different ways?
I don't know that people, a long time ago when unions came about, people didn't have any other way to have a voice, right? And so they needed some sort of central organizing force and someone to represent them to management. I think as we saw as a corollary in this last election, people have voices now through all kinds of different channels and mediums. So as a result, the core function that a union played isn't as relevant today as it was before. And so while I think you may see millennials push for broader social practices by companies than people, baby boomers did, or even people like me in their 40s do, I don't know that it will necessarily result in unionization itself. But at the same time, at least when it comes to setting the laws, so few people vote in municipal primaries, state legislative primaries, congressional primaries even, that for as long as turnout remains low, in some districts, unions will have disproportionate amount of political power, which means they'll continue to control Department of Labor and labor statutes and everything else. So look, one day if we're able to all vote in our cell phones and turnout goes from 16% to 80%, totally different ballgame. But I think that you'll see them have concentrated power, but I don't think the numbers will increase in terms of workforce participation.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Seattle, which passed or attempted to pass that ordinance, letting the Lyft and Uber drivers of the world sort of form some sort of union that got shot down by a federal judge last week, right, because we have a historical aversion to what we would call price fixing or cartels in this country. Not every country has that aversion, but you have this disconnect or these cross purposes of how do you give them a voice. At the same time, you're not allowed to let people who aren't, who are independent work together. And so that's just another example of sort of the breakdown in our current economy versus the legal system that exists for it.
All right, well, that is time. Thank you, Brian, William, Bradley. Thank you, WorkMarket.